You think a piece of paper scares me? Jackson Sterling grabbed the divorce papers from the table and tore them in half. Then he grabbed his pregnant wife's wrist hard and pulled her toward him. Olivia didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't beg. She simply looked at him and said, "There are copies." He released her wrist, stepped back, and that was when he noticed the second envelope. Still sealed, still waiting. His name was written on the front in her handwriting. He opened it. His hand stopped moving, because inside wasn't more divorce papers. Inside was evidence that could send his father to prison and take Jackson down with him. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and follow along until the very last word. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The greenhouse sat at the far edge of the Sterling estate, tucked behind the main house like an afterthought. Glass walls, climbing vines, the smell of soil, and something living. Olivia had built it herself, or rather she had designed every inch of it and watched it rise from bare ground during the second year of her marriage, when she still believed that putting down roots in this place meant something. It was 4:37 in the morning when Jackson pushed open the greenhouse door. He expected darkness. He expected silence. He expected to slip upstairs, shower off the evening, and slide into bed beside a wife who had long since learned that asking questions cost more than the answers were worth. What he did not expect was light. Warm, low light coming from the single lamp in the corner. And sitting beneath that light in the wrought iron chair beside the potting table was Olivia. She was wearing a cream-colored robe. Her dark hair was pulled back simply. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was 35 weeks pregnant, and she sat with the stillness of someone who had been waiting not for minutes, but for months. On the table in front of her sat a single white envelope. Jackson stopped walking. Something moved through him, not guilt, not quite. More like the sudden animal awareness that the terrain had shifted beneath his feet without him noticing. Liv. He said her name the way he said most things, like a tool, like a word that was supposed to unlock a door. "What are you doing up?" She looked at him. Just looked. No tears, no trembling lip. No the exhausted, wounded expression he had grown so accustomed to seeing that he had stopped registering it entirely. "Sit down, Jackson," she said. Her voice was quiet. That was the thing that moved through him like cold water. Not loud, not breaking, quiet in a way that had weight behind it. "I just got in, I'm tired. Sit down." He sat. He didn't know why he sat. Later he would think about that moment many times. Jackson Sterling, who had fired executives without blinking, who had demolished competitors and walked away from the wreckage without looking back, sat down in a garden chair at 4:30 in the morning because his pregnant wife told him to, and he didn't understand his own obedience until much, much later. She reached forward and slid the envelope across the table toward him. He looked at it. Clean white. No markings on the outside. "What is this? Open it." He picked it up, turned it over, broke the seal. Inside were 3 things. The first was a photograph, high resolution taken from a distance but perfectly clear. It showed Jackson and a woman named Celeste Vane outside a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. His hand was on the small of her back. They were laughing. The timestamp in the corner read 11:42 p.m., that same evening. The second was a document, 14 pages, dense with text dates, locations, financial transactions, hotel records, phone logs, a timeline. Meticulous, thorough, and covering not 3 months, not 6, but 19 months of documented behavior. The third was a single sheet of paper, clean formatting legal language. The heading read, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage, Olivia Catherine Sterling Petitioner. Divorce papers, already filed." Jackson set everything down on the table slowly. He looked at his wife. "You hired someone," he said. It wasn't a question. "I hired Nathan Reed," she said. "Former federal prosecutor. He's been working for me for 8 months." 8 months. Jackson repeated the words, tasted them. "You've been building a case against me for 8 months." "I've been protecting myself for 8 months," Olivia said. "And our son." His eyes dropped to her stomach, then back to her face. "Olivia, listen to me. Whatever you think you know, I know everything, Jackson." She said it simply, no venom, No theater, just the flat, factual weight of a woman who had done her homework and was no longer afraid of the test. I know about Celeste. I know about the apartment on 53rd Street that you're paying for under a company account. I know about the weekend in Nantucket in March, the trip to London in September that you told me was a board meeting, and I know that you had dinner with her last Tuesday at Le Bernardin and charged it to the Sterling Global corporate card under client entertainment. She paused. I know what wine you ordered. The silence in the greenhouse was complete. Jackson felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt cornered. Okay. He leaned forward, placed his hands on the table, and shifted his voice into the register he used when he needed to restructure a situation. Calm, authoritative, reasonable. Okay, you want a divorce. Fine. We can talk about that. We can sit down with attorneys. We can be civilized about this. We can make sure you and the baby are taken care of. I don't need you to take care of me, Jackson. She tilted her head slightly, and something in her eyes shifted. That's rather the point. You signed a prenuptial agreement. I did. Then you know what you're entitled to. The terms are very clear. They were, Olivia said, and then for the first time, something close to a smile moved across her face, not warm, precise, like the edge of a blade catching light. They were clear when we signed them. Things have changed since then. Jackson went still. What does that mean? It means, she said, reaching into the pocket of her robe and producing a second folded document, which she placed on the table with the same unhurried care she might use to set down a teacup, that Nathan didn't just find photographs. Jackson looked at the document. He didn't touch it. He found something else, Olivia continued. While he was investigating your relationship with Celeste, he followed the money, as former federal prosecutors tend to do. She paused. The apartment on 53rd Street is paid through a subsidiary called Meridian Consulting. Meridian Consulting is registered in Delaware and has no employees, no clients, and no actual business activity, but it receives quarterly transfers from a holding company based in the Cayman Islands. Another pause. A holding company that 2 weeks ago made a wire transfer to the private account of a sitting member of the SEC Oversight Committee. The blood left Jackson's face. He understood in that moment that this conversation was no longer about an affair. I'm not that has nothing to do with me, he said. His voice had changed. The authority was still there, but something underneath it had cracked. That's a financial structure my father set up years before I took over the company. I wasn't involved in... Your signature is on the transfer authorization, Olivia said, dated 14 months ago. Jackson opened his mouth, closed it. She watched him the way you watch someone standing at the edge of something very high, not with pleasure, but with a kind of steady, clear-eyed attention. I want you to understand something, she said softly. I am not doing this to hurt you. I am doing this because I have a son coming into this world in 5 weeks, and I will not raise him in a house built on what this house is built on. Her voice didn't shake, not once. You can fight the divorce. You can call your attorneys tonight. You can freeze the accounts. You can do everything you're already planning to do in the back of your mind right now. I expected all of that. Nathan expected all of that. She stood slowly, one hand resting on her stomach. Or you can make this clean. Either way, what I know doesn't change. What Nathan documented doesn't change. The only thing that changes is how many other people find out about it and how soon. Jackson stood up too, and for a moment, just a moment, something passed across his face that wasn't strategy or anger or the reflexive calculation he applied to every problem. It was something rawer than that, something almost like grief. But it passed. You have no idea what you've stepped into, he said. I know exactly what I've stepped into, Olivia said. I've spent 8 months learning every detail of it. She picked up her lamp and she walked out of the greenhouse. Jackson stood alone among the plants and the darkness and the white envelope on the table, and for the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. He called his attorney at 5 a.m. Gerald Marsh had been representing the Sterling family for 22 years. He had handled 3 hostile takeovers, 2 federal inquiries, and 1 estate dispute that nearly destroyed a sibling relationship permanently. He was not a man who rattled easily. When Jackson finished talking, there was a pause on the other end of the line. She filed already, Gerald said. "Papers already submitted, last Tuesday." Another pause. "She's been planning this for a while. 8 months. She had a former federal prosecutor running a parallel investigation." Gerald was quiet for a long moment. "Jackson, I need you to tell me something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. The financial structures she mentioned, the Meridian account, the Cayman transfer, how exposed are we?" The word "we" landed oddly. Jackson noticed it. "That's a Sterling Global structure," he said. "It predates my tenure as CEO." "But your signature is on the authorization." "Yes. 14 months ago." "Yes." Gerald exhaled slowly. "All right. Don't do anything tonight. Don't move. Money, don't make calls. Don't contact Celeste. I'll reach out to the financial team in the morning and we'll assess the exposure before we respond to anything." He paused again. "Does your father know?" Jackson looked out the window. The sky was beginning to pale. Just barely. The edge of morning creeping in before the darkness was ready to let go. "Not yet," he said. "You should call him." Jackson didn't answer. "Jackson, you should call your father." "I heard you," he said, and he hung up. He did not call his father that night. Instead, he sat in his study with a glass of scotch he didn't drink and turned over what he knew. Olivia had always been the quiet one. That was what people said about her. Jackson's friends, his colleagues, even his own mother before she passed. They had all remarked with varying degrees of condescension on how calm Olivia was, how measured, how she never raised her voice at functions, never inserted herself into business conversations, never seemed threatened by the world that surrounded her husband. He had taken that for passivity. He understood now, sitting in his darkened study at 5 a.m, that he had misread every signal she had ever sent him. Olivia wasn't passive. Olivia was patient. There was a profound and fundamental difference between those two things, and he had spent 4 years of marriage confusing one for the other. She had been watching him, not the way a suspicious spouse watches, frantically, emotionally searching for evidence of what they fear. She had watched him the way an investigator watches, methodically, building a record, waiting until the record was complete. And while he had been careless, distracted, certain of his own invulnerability, she had been building something he never saw coming. He refilled his glass, didn't drink it. He thought about the financial documents she had described. The Meridian structure wasn't something he had created. That was the truth. The holding company, the Cayman account, the flow of money through subsidiary entities his father had built, that architecture years before Jackson ever sat in the CEO's chair. Richard Sterling had been routing money through shell structures since the late 90s, long before the regulatory environment tightened and that kind of thing became genuinely dangerous. But Jackson had known about it. That was the uncomfortable reality. He had known, and he had signed the authorization because his father had told him it was a legacy structure that needed to stay in place for reasons that didn't require detailed explanation. And Jackson, who had learned early that his father's reasons did not require detailed explanation, had signed. He was 38 years old. He had been CEO of Sterling Global for 4 years. He had made decisions in that time that he was proud of. Growth decisions, strategic acquisitions. He had genuinely believed that he was steering the company into a cleaner, more legitimate future. He had not looked closely enough at what he was steering it away from. He set down the glass. Then he picked up his phone and called the one person he had been avoiding calling. It rang twice. "Jackson." His father's voice, even at 5 a.m, was completely alert. Richard Sterling had never in Jackson's memory sounded anything other than precisely awake and precisely in control. "I expected you'd call. Gerald reached me 20 minutes ago." Jackson felt something cold move through him. "Gerald called you," he said. "Gerald works for me." "Gerald has worked for this family for 22 years, his father said without particular emphasis. "Sit down, son. We need to talk about your wife." "My wife," Jackson said slowly, "is upstairs sleeping. Or not sleeping. I don't actually know what she's doing right now." "We underestimated her," Richard said, simply, factually, as though Olivia were a market competitor who had made an unexpected move. "That was a mistake. We won't make it twice." "Dad," Jackson stopped. "What do you mean this is my marriage? My situation." "Your situation," his father said, "is currently sitting on top of mine. The documents she has, if they're what Gerald described, those aren't just about your affair, Jackson. They reach significantly further than that. I know they reach further than that. Jackson's voice tightened. That's why I'm asking you what exactly I signed 14 months ago. That authorization. What was I actually authorizing? Silence. A very specific kind of silence. The kind Richard Sterling used when he was choosing his words with great care. We'll talk about this in person, his father said. Come to the house at 9. Don't speak to Olivia before then. And don't answer the question, Jackson said. His voice came out harder than he planned. What did I sign? An operational authorization. Standard. Dad. Another silence. Come to the house at 9, Richard said. Everything will be clearer then. He hung up. And Jackson sat there with the dead phone in his hand, and he realized for the first time that his father had not actually answered the question. He went to the house. Richard Sterling's estate in Greenwich was older than Jackson's, quieter, more formal. It had the feeling of a place that had been designed to communicate power rather than to be lived in. Heavy wood, high ceilings, art on the walls that people recognized. It was the kind of house that said to anyone who entered it, "You are inside someone else's domain now. Adjust accordingly." Jackson had adjusted accordingly for most of his life. He arrived at 9. His father was already at the table in the study, coffee in hand, 2 attorneys Jackson didn't recognize seated to his right. "Who are they?" Jackson said, stopping in the doorway. "Sit down," his father said. And Jackson recognized with a jolt of something unpleasant that he had sat down the same way 4 hours ago when Olivia had said the same words. Maybe it was just the morning for doing what he was told. He sat. "The first thing we need to establish," Richard began without preamble, without asking how Jackson was, without any acknowledgement that this was also in some dimension a personal crisis for his son, "is damage control. The documents your wife has given to her investigator. How do you know what documents she has?" His father looked at him. "Because I know what there is to find." Jackson stared at him. "You knew she was investigating. We became aware of the inquiry approximately 6 weeks ago." "You became—" Jackson stopped, restarted. "You knew for 6 weeks that my wife had hired a federal prosecutor to investigate Sterling Global, and you didn't tell me. We were managing it. You were managing it." Jackson set his hands flat on the table. "She handed me divorce papers this morning, Dad. She handed me documented evidence of financial crimes. She has a prenup that is now potentially void because of fraud claims she can bring. She is 35 weeks pregnant with my son, and you were managing it." For the first time, something shifted in Richard Sterling's expression. Not guilt, not remorse. Something more like recalibration. He looked at his son across the table the way you might look at a bridge you'd been counting on and had just realized might not hold the weight. "The affair was a complication," his father said carefully. "The affair?" Jackson laughed. Actually laughed, though nothing was funny. "You're calling 19 months of documented infidelity a complication." "What I am telling you," Richard said, his voice cooling, "is that the affair is what gave her the legal standing to start pulling at threads. Without the personal grievance, a woman in her position has no motivation to look that carefully. The affair was the door she walked through. What she found on the other side is the problem." "What did she find?" Jackson said. "I need you to tell me exactly what she found, because I signed a document 14 months ago that you told me was a routine operational authorization, and I need to understand what I was actually authorizing." The 2 attorneys exchanged a glance. Richard Sterling set down his coffee cup, folded his hands. "The Cayman structure," he said, "has been in place since 1998. Originally, it served a legitimate purpose, tax optimization in international markets. Over time, its function evolved." "Evolved," Jackson repeated. "There were certain regulatory relationships that needed to be maintained, certain individuals in oversight positions who needed to understand that cooperation with Sterling Global was mutually beneficial." He paused. "The payment that your wife's investigator traced to the SEC committee member was not the first such payment. It was simply the most recent." Jackson was quiet for a long time. "You've been bribing federal regulators," he said. "I prefer to think of it as managing relationships." "For how long?" "Portions of the structure date back to 2001. "How many people?" "Over the years, a number." "Dad," Jackson's voice had gone very flat, very still. "How many people have we been paying Richard Sterling looked at his son. 11, he said, over a period of approximately 23 years. The room was silent. Jackson stood up from the table. He walked to the window. He stood there and looked out at the manicured grounds of his father's estate, the grounds where he had learned to ride a bike, where he had practiced for his first business presentations, while his father watched from a lawn chair with measured approval, where he had brought Olivia the first time he introduced her to his family. And she had stood right here by this window and said quietly, "This is a very beautiful place." And he had felt proud in a way he hadn't examined closely enough. He turned around. "I need you to understand something," Jackson said. "Jackson." "No." He said it sharply. "You will let me speak." He had never spoken to his father that way. Not once in 42 years. He watched his father's expression change, and he did not flinch from it. "I took over this company 4 years ago. I thought I was building something. I thought I was running a legitimate operation and making it better. And what you're telling me is that for the entire duration of my tenure, I have been the public face of a criminal enterprise that predates my involvement by 20 years. He stopped. "And when my wife started pulling at the edges of it, you knew, and you decided to manage it, without telling me." "You had plausible deniability." "Don't." Jackson's voice broke on the word, not emotionally, structurally the way a beam cracks under load. "Do not tell me about deniability. You signed me up for this. You put my name on it. You made me the face of it. And when the walls started closing in, you were going to what? Let me take the fall." Richard Sterling's expression didn't change. And in that stillness, in that unchanged, unruffled, calculated stillness, Jackson Sterling finally saw his father clearly. Not as a patriarch, not as a mentor, not as the formidable man who had shaped everything he was and everything he had become, as a man who had always been thinking 3 steps ahead, who had always been the one who survived. Jackson picked up his jacket from the chair. "I'm going home," he said. "Jackson, we need to develop a strategy." "I know." He walked to the door, put his hand on the frame, turned back once. "That's what I'm going to do." He walked out. Behind him, his father and the 2 attorneys sat in silence for a moment. Then Richard Sterling picked up his phone. Jackson drove home without the radio. He drove through the gray morning, through the familiar landscape of wealth and order and manicured certainty that had always felt to him like the natural texture of the world, because it was the only world he had ever known. And he thought about his wife sitting in the greenhouse before dawn, patient and quiet and completely prepared, and he thought about his son not yet born, not yet named, and he thought about what that child was going to inherit. Not money, not power, not the careful architecture of success that Richard Sterling had spent a lifetime building. Secrets, a foundation built on 23 years of managed corruption, and a name that was going to be on the front page of newspapers before the year was out unless something changed. He pulled into the driveway and sat in the car. He thought about Olivia's voice in the greenhouse, the steadiness of it. He had spent 4 years underestimating her, and she had spent those same 4 years becoming exactly the thing the situation required. She hadn't broken. She hadn't collapsed. She hadn't confronted him in anger or desperation. She had simply gathered the truth, organized it carefully, and placed it on a table. He thought about what she had said. "Either way, what I know doesn't change." She was right. He sat with that for a moment. Then he got out of the car and went inside. Olivia was in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea, looking out the window. She heard him come in and turned slightly, but didn't speak. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten breakfast together 1,000 times, where he had read the news on his phone while she organized her day in the planner she kept beside her coffee, where life had moved through its ordinary rhythms, and he had been too distracted by everything else to understand what ordinary meant. "I went to see my father," he said. She turned fully to look at him. "And," she said, "he told me things," Jackson said slowly, "about the company, about the financial structure, about how long it's been going on." He stopped. "I didn't know all of it. I want you to know that. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just telling you that some of what Nathan found, I didn't know the full picture." Olivia watched him. "What did you know?" "I knew there were structures I didn't fully understand. I told myself it wasn't my business because my father had built them before I took over, and I trusted that he wouldn't put me in a position. He stopped again. That was stupid. And convenient. I used my own ignorance as an excuse to not look closely at something I should have looked closely at. The kitchen was quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" Olivia said. "Because you deserve to hear it." He looked at his hands. "And because I think we have a much bigger problem than either of us individually, and I don't know how to fix it without understanding what you actually want out of this." Olivia set down her mug. She sat down across from him slowly, carefully, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach. "I want the truth," she said, "documented on the record and accountable. I want our son to grow up in a world where the people around him are held to consequences. I want the divorce, and I want the terms we should have negotiated before any of this began." She paused. "And I want your father to face what he built." Jackson nodded slowly. "I think," he said, "that might be possible." "Why?" He looked up at her. "Because I think I'm willing to help make it happen." Olivia looked at him for a long time. Her expression was unreadable, not cold, but not warm. Somewhere in the difficult, honest territory between two people who have damaged each other and are sitting with the reality of what comes next. "I'll have Nathan call your attorney," she said at last. "Nathan doesn't need to call Gerald," Jackson said. "Gerald is my father's man. He called my father before he called me this morning." Something moved through Olivia's eyes. "Then find your own attorney," she said. "I already have someone in mind." She nodded once. Then she stood up, picked up her mug, and walked to the doorway. She paused there. "Jackson," she said without turning around. "Yeah, whatever you decide to do next, do it because it's right." A pause. "Not because you're angry at your father, not because you're scared, because our son is going to ask questions someday about all of this, and the answer you give him is going to matter more than anything else you ever do." She walked out. Jackson sat alone in the kitchen. Outside the window, the morning had fully arrived. Gray had given way to pale light, and the world was going about its business with the indifferent momentum it always maintained, regardless of what fell apart inside the houses it moved through. He sat there for a long time. And then he picked up his phone and dialed a number that wasn't Gerald Marsh. The phone rang twice. "This is Nathan Reed," said the voice on the other end. Jackson Sterling took a breath. "Mr. Reed," he said, "my name is Jackson Sterling. I think it's time you and I had a conversation." A pause. "I've been wondering when you'd call," Nathan said. "Then you know why I'm calling." "I have a pretty good idea," Nathan said. "Why don't you start by telling me what your father told you this morning?" Jackson looked out the window at the morning light. "Everything," he said, and he began. Nathan Reed arrived at the Sterling estate at 7:15 in the morning, 45 minutes after Jackson called him. He drove himself. No assistant, no paralegal. Just a man in a gray coat carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived 20 years of federal courtrooms, because it had. Olivia met him at the door before Jackson could. "He called you," she said. "It wasn't a question." "He did," Nathan said. "What did he say?" "He said he wanted to talk." Nathan looked at her steadily. "I told him I'd come if you were present." He agreed. Olivia studied him for a moment. Then she stepped aside and let him in. Jackson was in the living room. He was still in yesterday's clothes. He hadn't showered. He looked like a man who had aged 6 years between midnight and morning, which in every way that mattered he had. He stood up when Nathan walked in, and there was something almost automatic about it, the reflex of a man who had spent his life being the most powerful person in any room, suddenly unsure whether that was still true. "Mr. Reed," he said. "Mr. Sterling." Nathan didn't extend his hand. He sat down across from Jackson and placed the briefcase on the coffee table. "Your wife tells me you've been in contact with your father this morning." "I went to see him at 9. And," Jackson looked at Olivia, who had sat down in the chair to Nathan's left. Her hands folded in her lap, her expression exactly as composed as it had been in the greenhouse 6 hours ago. "He told me the Cayman structure goes back to 1998, Jackson said. "He told me there have been payments to 11 individuals in federal oversight positions over approximately 23 years. He paused. "He also told me that Gerald Marsh, my attorney, called him before he called me this morning." Nathan didn't react visibly, but he opened the briefcase and took out a legal pad and wrote something on it slowly, deliberately. "That's useful," he said. "Is it? It tells us that your father is already in coordination mode. He's not panicking, he's managing." Nathan clicked his pen. "Which means we have less time than I'd like before he starts moving pieces." "What kind of pieces?" Jackson said. "Witnesses, documents, financial records that might currently exist and might very soon not exist." Nathan looked at him directly. "Mr. Sterling, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, because the next 24 hours depend on it." "Ask? Are you here because you want to protect yourself from your father, or are you here because you want to do the right thing?" The room was quiet. Jackson didn't answer immediately. He sat with the question. Olivia watched him sit with it, and she didn't fill the silence, and Nathan didn't fill the silence, and the house held the weight of it without flinching. "I don't know yet," Jackson finally said. "I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know exactly where one of those ends and the other begins right now. But I know what I saw in my father's face this morning when I asked him if he was going to let me take the fall. And I know what that told me about the last 42 years. He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I know my son is going to be born in 5 weeks, and I know what kind of world I'm leaving him if I do nothing." Nathan looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Olivia. She gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. "All right," Nathan said. He opened the briefcase wider and began laying documents on the coffee table. "Then here's what we're working with." What Nathan Reed spread across that coffee table over the next 40 minutes was not just the story of one man's affair. It was the story of a company, a family, a carefully constructed empire built on a foundation that had been quietly rotting for more than 2 decades and held together by money and silence and the specific kind of loyalty that is really just fear wearing a more acceptable name. There were bank records showing the transfer chain from Sterling Global's legitimate operations through a series of subsidiary entities to the Cayman Holding Company. There were incorporation documents for 6 shell companies registered across 3 different countries. There were emails printed, sourced, time-stamped between Richard Sterling and a man named Douglas Hale, who had served on the SEC Oversight Committee until 18 months ago, and who had quietly resigned citing health reasons, which was true in the narrow sense that being paid $2 million over 7 years to look the other way tends to eventually affect a person's health. And there was one more thing. Nathan placed it on the table last, a single printed email thread, 12 messages, dated over a period of 3 weeks, 9 months ago. Jackson picked it up, read the first message, put it down. "That's my father's email address," he said. "Yes." "And the other address, a private account belonging to a man named Carl Whitfield." Nathan paused. "Carl Whitfield is currently the deputy director of the SEC's Enforcement Division." Jackson looked up. "My father has been communicating directly with the deputy director of SEC Enforcement," he said. "For at least the past 2 years, yes. The emails you're holding document a conversation in which your father was informed in advance that Sterling Global was going to be the subject of a routine compliance review, and in which he was also informed approximately 6 days later that the review had been, in the deputy director's words, deprioritized due to resource allocation." "He killed an SEC investigation," Olivia said quietly. She wasn't asking. "Before it started," Nathan confirmed. Jackson set the email thread back on the table. He stood up and walked to the window, the same way he had walked to the window in his father's study that morning, and for a moment the posture was identical, a man standing at glass looking out at a world that had rearranged itself into something unfamiliar. "If this reaches the Justice Department," he said without turning around. "When?" Nathan said. "Not if. The question is how and who is carrying it and whether you are in front of it or underneath it." Jackson turned around. Meaning there is a version of this story where you are the man who came forward, who cooperated, who provided documentation voluntarily and accepted accountability for what you signed while demonstrating that the criminal architecture predates your involvement. Nathan held his gaze. And there is a version where federal investigators find all of this themselves, piece by piece, and you are simply one more name on the authorization forms. "Those are very different outcomes," Jackson said. "They are," Nathan agreed. "You've thought about this already," Jackson said. He wasn't accusatory, just observant. You had this conversation prepared before you walked in here. I've been preparing for this conversation for 8 months, Nathan said. Jackson almost smiled. There was nothing happy in it. My wife hired a very thorough man. Your wife, Nathan said, is a very thorough woman. Olivia said nothing. She was looking at the documents on the table with an expression that was not satisfaction and not grief and not anger, but something in the complicated space between all three. There's something else you need to know, she said. She said it quietly, and both men looked at her. What? Jackson said. This morning after you left for your father's house, I had a call. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and placed her phone on the table screen up. From a blocked number. A man's voice. He told me that if I continued pursuing the divorce filing certain information about my family's finances, specifically about my brother's business, which has nothing to do with any of this, would find its way to the press. The room was very still. Jackson stared at her. Someone threatened you? Yes. This morning, while I was sitting in my father's study. Yes. He turned to Nathan. Can you trace a blocked call? Depends on the method used, Nathan said. He was already writing. But the timing is significant regardless. It tells us that Richard Sterling moved within 2 hours of your visit. He has someone watching this house, or he has someone inside your circle who reported back. He looked at Jackson. The call was almost certainly not made by your father personally. He would have used an intermediary, which means there's a third party involved in managing this situation who we haven't fully identified yet. My father has a man, Jackson said slowly. Has had him for years, Elliot Graves. He handles situations. He's never had an official title at Sterling Global. He's just always been there. Nathan wrote the name down. I need everything you know about Elliot Graves, he said. I know he went to law school with my father. I know he lives in Connecticut. I know he's made problems go away for 40 years, and I never asked how. Jackson stopped. I know that this morning when I walked into my father's study and saw 2 attorneys I'd never met before, I think one of them might have been Graves. Can you describe him? 60, 65, silver hair, very still. The kind of still that isn't calm, it's controlled. Jackson paused. He looked at me like I was a liability. Nathan set down his pen. Because to him, Nathan said carefully, you might be. That landed in the room, and nobody moved for a moment. It was Olivia who spoke first. Jackson, she said, I need you to listen to me very carefully. She leaned forward slightly. Your father has been protecting this structure for 23 years. He has survived regulatory inquiries and market downturns and changes in administration and all of it because he has always been willing to sacrifice whatever he needed to sacrifice to keep the core of it intact. She paused. You signed a document 14 months ago. You are currently the CEO. You are the public face of Sterling Global, and your marriage is falling apart in a way that is going to attract press attention very soon. She held his gaze. What does your father sacrifice when he needs to protect the empire? Jackson heard the question. He really heard it, and the answer moved through him like something physical. Me, he said. He will hand you to the federal government if he has to, Olivia said. He will hand you the authorization forms and your signature and a narrative that positions you as a rogue executive who operated without his knowledge. He will be devastated. He will cooperate fully. He will cry at the press conference. Her voice was steady and precise and completely without cruelty. She was not enjoying this. He could see that she was just telling him the truth. And you will spend the next several years in a federal proceeding while your father restructures the company under a different name and continues exactly as before. Jackson stood absolutely still. He said I had plausible deniability, he said almost to himself. No, Nathan said. He said he preferred you have plausible deniability, past tense. That was before this morning. Before you walked into his study and told him you knew about the full structure, and before you left without committing to a coordinated response. Nathan's voice was measured. When you walked out of that house without agreeing to his strategy, you stopped being an asset he was protecting and started being a variable he needs to manage. Jackson sat back down. He put his face in his hands for a moment. Just a moment. Then he lifted his head and his expression had changed, not broken, reorganized, like a man who has just accepted the actual dimensions of the problem he's dealing with and is recalculating from ground zero. "What do I do?" he said. "Today," Nathan said, "we document everything you know. Dates, conversations, transactions, anything your father told you this morning, and anything you've observed over your 4 years as CEO that you didn't fully interrogate at the time. We create a voluntary disclosure package." He paused. "And I reach out to a contact at the Justice Department, someone I trust, someone who is not connected to Douglas Hale or Carl Whitfield or anyone else in your father's network." "You have that contact," Jackson said. "I was a federal prosecutor for 11 years, Nathan said. "I have many contacts." "And Olivia," Jackson said. He looked at her. "The divorce filing, the prenup challenge." "Those proceed independently," Nathan said. "On a parallel track, your cooperation in the federal matter strengthens Olivia's position in the civil proceedings, but they are separate processes." "I'm not asking about my position," Jackson said, and something in his voice shifted in a way that surprised even him. "I'm asking if she's protected, from my father, from whoever made that phone call this morning." He looked at Olivia directly. "I want to know that you're safe." Olivia looked at him. For just a moment, just a single unguarded moment, something moved behind her eyes that wasn't strategy or preparation or the careful composure she had maintained through every hour of this impossible morning. Something human and complicated and tired. "I've had security on this property since last week," she said. "Nathan arranged it." "You knew this was coming," Jackson said. "I prepared for the possibility," she said. "That's not the same thing." "But you thought my father might." "I thought that when this envelope opened, the people who had the most to lose would react the way powerful people always react when they're cornered." She held his gaze. "I made sure I wasn't standing in the open when that happened." Jackson looked at her for a long moment. His pregnant wife, the woman he had underestimated for 4 years, the woman who had sat alone in a greenhouse before dawn and changed the entire trajectory of everything with a single white envelope and the courage to hand it to him. "I'm sorry," he said. "It came out plainly. No performance in it. No strategy." Olivia received it the same way. "I know," she said. Then Nathan Reed cleared his throat gently and said, "We have a lot of work to do and not much time to do it." And the moment closed, and both of them turned back to the documents on the table, back to the work of dismantling the world they had been living in, piece by careful piece. They worked for 3 hours. Nathan took Jackson through every conversation he could recall with his father regarding the financial structure. Every instruction, every document he had signed, every meeting where Richard Sterling had spoken in the careful elliptical way he used when he was giving someone a directive while maintaining the fiction that he was only having a conversation. Jackson's memory was good, sharp, and detailed. The memory of a man who had navigated high-stakes environments for 20 years. And Nathan wrote steadily, asking precise follow-up questions, building the timeline with the methodical patience of someone who had done exactly this many times in exactly this kind of situation. Olivia sat with them and said little, but when she did speak, it was always the exact right question or the exact right clarifying detail. And Jackson noticed, not for the first time that morning, that she had not simply hired Nathan Reed to take photographs of a cheating husband. She had spent 8 months becoming fluent in the territory. She understood the financial structures. She understood the legal exposure. She understood, probably better than Jackson did, what the next several months were going to look like. At 11:40, Nathan's phone rang. He looked at the screen and his expression changed slightly, not alarm, but heightened attention. He stepped out of the room. Jackson looked at Olivia. "Is he always like this?" he said. "Like what?" "Unshakable." She almost smiled. "He told me once that the thing about federal prosecution is that you can't afford to be surprised by anything. You assume the worst and you prepare for it. If something better happens, you're grateful. If it doesn't, you're ready." Smart philosophy. "It's a good way to live, actually," she said. And there was something in the way she said it, quiet, with a weight behind it, that told Jackson she wasn't just talking about Nathan. Nathan came back in. He sat down. "That was a source inside the Sterling Global Board," he said. "An emergency board meeting has been called for this afternoon, 2 p.m. Jackson went still. "Who called it?" "Your father." What's the agenda? Nathan looked at him steadily. Leadership continuity and crisis management. The words landed like stones in still water. Leadership continuity. Jackson understood what that meant. Every person who had ever worked in a boardroom understood what that meant when it was called without warning on a Tuesday morning by the company's founder. "He's moving to remove me," Jackson said. "He's moving to position himself to remove you if he needs to," Nathan said. "Which means he already has the votes, or he believes he can get them, or he's calling the meeting to find out." "He has the votes," Jackson said. His voice was flat, certain. "He's never not had the votes. The board is his board. Half of them have been there since before I was born." He stood up again. "I need to be at that meeting." "That may not be advisable." "I need to be at that meeting," Jackson repeated. "If he removes me in a meeting I'm not present for, I lose the last leverage I have over the public narrative. I am still the CEO of Sterling Global until that board votes otherwise, and I intend to walk into that boardroom and stand in front of every person in it and make them look me in the eye before they make any decisions." Nathan looked at Olivia. She looked at Jackson. "Go," she said. He nodded. "Nathan," he said, picking up his jacket, "how quickly can you get the voluntary disclosure package to your Justice Department? Contact. If we work through the rest of the morning, I can have a preliminary filing ready by end of business today. Do it." He stopped at the doorway. "And Nathan, the call this morning, the threat against Olivia's brother, I want to know who made it, and I want documentation." "Already working on it," Nathan said. Jackson looked at his wife one more time. She was sitting straight-backed in her chair, one hand resting on her stomach, her eyes clear and her expression steady, and her whole presence radiating the specific quiet strength of someone who has already survived the worst part and knows it. "Thank you," he said. He meant it for everything, for the greenhouse, for the envelope, for the 8 months of preparation, for the fact that she had told him the truth, even when she had every reason to simply wound him with it. She held his gaze. "Just don't let him win," she said. Jackson Sterling walked out the door, and Olivia turned back to Nathan Reed and said, "Now, tell me everything else you found, the parts you haven't shown him yet." Nathan looked at her carefully. "You held something back from the disclosure." "There are things Jackson needs to know for today," she said, "and there are things that need to be kept separate until we understand exactly how far his father's reach goes." She paused. How many other people inside Sterling Global knew about the payments? Nathan reached into the briefcase. "That," he said, "is where it gets considerably more complicated." He placed a new set of documents on the table. And Olivia Sterling, 35 weeks pregnant and sitting in the ruins of her marriage, leaned forward and began to read. The documents Nathan placed in front of Olivia were not what she expected. She had spent 8 months building a case. She had been methodical, patient, precise. She thought she understood the full architecture of what Richard Sterling had constructed over 23 years. She thought she had found the edges of it. She had not found the edges of it. "How many people inside Sterling Global?" she asked again, her voice steady even as her eyes moved across the first page. "Confirmed with documentation," Nathan said. 7. Suspected based on financial patterns and communication records, closer to 14. 14 people inside the company, Olivia said slowly. Who knew about the payments to federal regulators? Who knew, and in several cases actively facilitated the transfers? Nathan pointed to a name near the top of the second page. "This one is the CFO, Malcolm Reyes. He's been with Sterling Global for 11 years. His fingerprints are on 6 of the 11 transfer authorizations, always as a secondary signatory." Olivia looked at the name. She knew Malcolm. Not well, he was Jackson's colleague, not her friend, but she had sat across from him at company dinners. He had a wife named Patricia and 2 daughters in private school and a house in Westport that he'd mentioned once casually, the way people mention things they're quietly proud of. "Does he know we have this?" she asked. "Not yet," Nathan said. "But when Richard Sterling walks into that board meeting this afternoon, Malcolm Reyes will almost certainly be in the room. And Richard will tell him whatever he needs to tell him to secure his loyalty for the next 48 hours. Which means Malcolm becomes a problem. Malcolm becomes a variable," Nathan said carefully. He's not a true believer. He's a man who made a series of bad decisions over 11 years and has been living with the weight of them. People like that, when the structure starts to crack, they don't always go the direction you expect. Olivia considered that. He could flip, she said. He could, Nathan agreed. Or he could panic and do something that makes everything worse for everyone. He paused. There's a window right now before Richard gets to him this afternoon. If someone reaches Malcolm Reyes before that board meeting... Jackson, Olivia said. Jackson is walking into a boardroom in... Nathan checked his watch. 2 hours and 20 minutes. He doesn't have time. Then I'll go, Olivia said. Nathan looked at her. You're 35 weeks pregnant. I'm also the only person in this situation that Malcolm Reyes has absolutely no reason to be afraid of, she said. He doesn't see me as a threat. He never has. None of them ever did. She said it without bitterness, just fact. Call him. Tell him I want to meet. Tell him it's urgent and private, and that if he values his daughter's futures, he should hear what I have to say before 2 p.m. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his phone. It was 12:17 p.m. Malcolm Reyes picked up on the second ring. Nathan spoke to him for less than 90 seconds. When he hung up, he looked at Olivia. He'll meet you, he said. 1 o'clock, coffee shop in Midtown. He chose the location. Of course he did, Olivia said, standing carefully. He wants a public place. He's already scared. Olivia, Nathan's voice was careful, be cautious. If Richard has already spoken to him this morning... Then he'll be even more scared, she said, and scared people are easier to reach than comfortable ones. She picked up her coat. Have someone outside, just in case. She walked out. Nathan sat alone with the documents for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a second call. To his Justice Department contact. And this time, he didn't speak in preliminary terms. This time he said, we're ready to move. The drive to Midtown took 40 minutes. Olivia sat in the back of the car and felt her son move a slow, rolling shift that she had come to recognize as his response to her tension, as though he already understood from the inside when the world outside was holding its breath. She put her hand on her stomach and said nothing, and the city moved past the windows, indifferent and enormous and ongoing. Malcolm Reyes was already there when she arrived. He was sitting in the back corner, both hands around a coffee he hadn't touched, wearing a suit jacket over a shirt with no tie, which told her he had left his office in a hurry. He was 51 years old, silver at the temples, and he had the look of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had recently started to feel the actual weight of it. He stood up when he saw her, looked at her stomach, sat back down. Olivia, he said, I have to say I wasn't expecting... I know, she said, sitting down across from him. I wasn't what anyone was expecting. That's rather been the point. She folded her hands on the table. Malcolm, has Richard called you this morning? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Why would Richard... Has he called you? A pause. Yes. What did he say? Malcolm looked around the coffee shop. A reflex. Checking exits, checking faces. An innocent man doesn't do that. An innocent man doesn't know to. He said there might be some press attention coming, Malcolm said carefully. Something about Jackson and the divorce filing becoming public. He wanted to make sure the board was prepared to respond in a coordinated way. He didn't mention the SEC payments, Olivia said. The color left Malcolm Reyes's face so quickly and so completely that it looked almost medical. I don't know what you... Malcolm. Her voice was gentle, firm. I have the transfer authorizations. I have your signature on 6 of them. I have the email chain between Richard and Douglas Hale. I have the communication records between Richard and Carl Whitfield. She paused and let that settle. I also have, as of this morning, a former federal prosecutor who has already been in contact with the Justice Department. Another pause. What I don't have yet is your side of the story. Malcolm Reyes stared at her. You're not just divorcing Jackson, he said. It came out almost like wonder, like a man realizing he had badly misjudged the depth of a river he was standing in. I'm doing what needed to be done, she said. "And right now what needs to be done is for someone inside Sterling Global to tell the truth before Richard Sterling walks into that boardroom at 2 o'clock and spends the next 2 hours making sure the truth gets buried under 3 layers of crisis management and non-disclosure agreements." "If I talk to you," Malcolm said, his voice dropping low and unsteady, Richard, Olivia said, "is going to throw you under the same bus he's planning to throw Jackson under. You know that. On some level, you've known that for years." She leaned forward slightly. "You are not the architect of this, Malcolm. You are a man who was handed forms to sign by a man he worked for and trusted, and who told himself that he didn't need to know what he was signing, and who has been living with that choice for 11 years. She held his gaze. "That is a very different thing from being Richard Sterling, and the Justice Department knows how to tell the difference." Malcolm's hands tightened around the coffee cup. "My daughters," he said. His voice cracked on the word, just barely. "They're 17 and 14. If my name is in the papers, your name is going to be in the papers, Malcolm." She said it kindly, but without softening it. "The only question is whether it's the name of a man who cooperated fully and voluntarily, or the name of a man who stayed silent while the people around him negotiated their own arrangements." She paused. "Patricia deserves to know that you made the right choice when it mattered." The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Malcolm Reyes said quietly, "There's more than what you found." Olivia went very still. "What do you mean?" she said. "The payments to regulators," he said. "That's the part that's traceable. That's the part you found because Nathan Reed is very good at following money." He looked at his untouched coffee. "But there's a second structure, older than the payment network. I found it by accident 8 years ago, and Richard told me it was a legacy matter from the early days of the company, international licensing agreements from markets where certain arrangements were standard practice." He stopped. "I believed him. For about 6 months I believed him. And then I saw a name on one of the documents that I recognized, a name that had been in the news." He looked up at her. "A federal judge, Olivia, not a regulator. A sitting federal judge had been on Richard Sterling's payroll since 2003. The coffee shop continued its ordinary business around them, cups moving, voices rising and falling, the city's indifferent noise. Olivia kept her face completely still. "Which judge?" she said. Malcolm told her. She recognized the name. Anyone who read the business section would recognize the name. The judge had presided over 3 major corporate fraud cases in the past decade, 2 of them involving Sterling Global competitors, 2 of them resulting in settlements that had been at the time described as surprisingly favorable to the surviving parties. "Does Richard know that you know?" she asked. "He knows I know about the regulators," Malcolm said. "He doesn't know I found the judge." He exhaled slowly. "I never told anyone. I buried it because I was scared and because I had a mortgage and 2 kids in private school, and I told myself that if I didn't know the details, I wasn't really part of it." He rubbed a hand across his face. "I've been telling myself that for 8 years. "Malcolm," Olivia said, "I need you to write it down, everything, today, before 2 o'clock. If I do that, I will make sure Nathan Reed has your cooperation on record before anyone else has a chance to reframe your role in this." She held his gaze. "I cannot promise you there are no consequences. There will be consequences. But I can promise you that the alternative staying silent while this collapses is far worse for you, for Patricia, for your girls." She paused. "You called an Uber to get here, didn't you? You didn't use your company car." He blinked. "How did you—" "Because you're already thinking about what's traceable," she said. "That's not a guilty man's reflex. That's a frightened man's reflex, and frightened men who make the right choice at the right moment are not the same as guilty men who knew and chose silence." She stood up slowly. "I'm going to step outside and call Nathan. You're going to sit here and decide." She looked at him directly. "You have 15 minutes, Malcolm. Make them count." She walked outside. She stood on the sidewalk in the November air and called Nathan and said in a voice that was steadier than she felt, "There's a federal judge." A silence on the other end. "Say that again," Nathan said. She told him. All of it. She heard Nathan's breath change, not panic, the controlled recalibration of a man who is adding a significant new element to an already complex calculation. This changes the exposure profile substantially, Nathan said. If Richard has had a sitting federal judge in his network, it means some of the cases we thought were settled legitimately may need to be reopened, Olivia said. It means the scope of this is much larger than Sterling Global. She paused. It also means that when Richard realizes Malcolm talked to me today, the response will not be measured. You need to get out of that location, Nathan said immediately. Move somewhere public and crowded. I'll have someone with you in 15 minutes. I'm in Midtown at noon on a Tuesday, she said. I think I'm all right. Olivia, Nathan, her voice was firm. Go. Call your contact. Tell him we have a federal judge. She hung up. Behind her, through the coffee shop window, she could see Malcolm Reyes sitting in the corner with his hands flat on the table and his eyes focused on something only he could see. The posture of a man making a decision that would change every subsequent decision he ever made. She waited. At 12:58, her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 3 words. You should stop. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she photographed it and sent it to Nathan. He responded in under 30 seconds. Screenshot saved. Sending to my contact now. Are you safe? She typed back. Yes, and went back inside. Malcolm looked up when she sat down. I'll do it, he said. I'll give you everything. Good, she said. I want it on record that I've been trying to find a way out of this for 3 years, he said. I want that documented. Nathan will document it, she said. He's thorough. What happens to Jackson? Malcolm asked suddenly. She looked at him. Jackson is making his own choices today, she said. Meanwhile, across the city, Jackson Sterling walked into the Sterling Global boardroom at 1:58 p.m. He had changed clothes. That was the first thing his father noticed. He had gone home showered, put on a suit, composed himself. He walked in looking like the CEO of a $12 billion company, and he sat down at the head of the table because he was still the CEO, and he put his hands flat on the surface, and he looked at every face in the room. 11 board members, his father at the far end flanked by the 2 attorneys from the morning. Malcolm's chair was empty, which Richard noted with a slight tightening around his eyes. Where is Malcolm? Richard said. I don't know, Jackson said. Shall we begin? Richard looked at him steadily, measuring. Jackson, before we go into formal session, I'd like to suggest that you and I take a few minutes privately. No, Jackson said. The room went quiet. I'm sorry, Richard said. I said no. Jackson's voice was level. We're going to have this conversation in front of the full board. That's why you called them here, isn't it? So let's have it. He looked around the table. I'll start. He placed a folder on the table. He opened it. I want every person in this room to understand something clearly. This morning, my father informed me that Sterling Global has maintained a network of payments to federal regulators for 23 years. I want to know who in this room was aware of that. The silence was absolute. Jackson, his father began. I want to know, Jackson repeated, addressing the board members, who in this room knew, because in approximately, he checked his watch, 4 hours a voluntary disclosure package is being delivered to the Justice Department, and every person who is named as a knowing participant in this structure and who has not already been identified as a cooperating party is going to find themselves on the wrong side of a very clear line. 3 board members exchanged glances. One of them, Gerald Park, who had been on the board for 19 years, looked at his hands. Richard Sterling stood up. This is, he said, his voice carrying the full weight of 6 decades of authority, completely inappropriate. Jackson, you are clearly under significant personal stress, and I think before we— Sit down, Dad. Jackson said it quietly, but the room heard it. Sit down. Richard Sterling stopped speaking. He did not sit down. But he stopped speaking, and in that cessation, in that pause, something shifted in the room. 11 people watched a son speak to his father in a tone that had never been used in that room before, and 11 people recalibrated almost involuntarily their assessment of where power actually resided in this moment. I am going to say one more thing, Jackson said to the board, to his father, to the room. I spent 4 years believing I was building something worth building. I was wrong about that, and I take responsibility for not looking more carefully at what I was building it on. He paused. "But I'm not going to be the sacrifice. I am not going to be the name on the authorization forms, while the man who wrote the authorization handed me a pen stands at a press conference and calls me a rogue executive." He looked at his father directly. "I know what you were planning to do, and I am telling you in front of witnesses that it—" Claude's response was interrupted. "Try again. Will not happen." The boardroom held that sentence for a long moment. 11 people, 11 different calculations running behind 11 different pairs of eyes. Richard Sterling stood at the far end of the table and looked at his son with an expression that Jackson had never seen on his father's face before. Not anger, not surprise, something older and colder than either of those. The expression of a man who has just watched a piece of the architecture he built turn against the structure it was designed to support. "You're making a mistake," Richard said. His voice was quiet, controlled. The kind of quiet that in another context might sound like reason, but in this one sounded exactly like what it was. A warning. "I've made a lot of mistakes," Jackson said. "This isn't one of them." Gerald Park. The senior board member cleared his throat. He was 73 years old and had been on the Sterling Global Board since before Jackson could drive. He was the kind of man who had survived multiple corporate crises by being the first person in the room to understand which way the wind was actually blowing. "Jackson," Gerald said carefully, "when you say a voluntary disclosure is being delivered to the Justice Department this afternoon, is that already in motion?" "It is," Jackson said. "Then the board needs to convene an emergency legal counsel session immediately." Gerald looked around the table, not at Richard, at the other board members. Independent counsel, not Gerald Marsh, not anyone connected to the Sterling family directly. He paused. "I think everyone in this room understands why." 3 board members nodded before Richard could speak, and Richard Sterling, for the first time in Jackson's memory, looked like a man who was losing a room. It was 2:17 p.m. Richard's attorney, the one Jackson didn't recognize, the one he suspected was Elliot Graves, leaned forward and said something quietly into Richard's ear. Richard listened. His expression didn't change. He straightened his jacket. "This session is adjourned," Richard said. "We'll reconvene with appropriate counsel present." "Agreed," Gerald said, and then to Jackson very quietly as people began to stand, "You did the right thing coming in here today." Jackson looked at him. "You knew," he said, not accusatory, just recognizing the shape of something. Gerald was quiet for one beat. "I knew there were structures I didn't ask enough questions about." He held Jackson's gaze. "I'm 60 years older than I was the first time your father told me not to worry about something. I should have learned faster." He picked up his jacket. "Whatever you need from me, you'll have it." He walked out. Jackson stood alone at the head of the table for a moment after the room emptied. He could hear his father's voice in the hallway outside, low and rapid, talking to the attorneys. He couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. He knew the tone. It was the tone Richard Sterling used when he was restructuring a failed approach in real time, salvaging what could be salvaged, cutting what couldn't. Jackson's phone buzzed. "Nathan Reed, a text. Malcolm is with me. He's talking. You need to hear what he found." Jackson read it twice. Then he walked out of the boardroom and didn't look back. He met Nathan and Malcolm at Nathan's office on Park Avenue at 3:45. The office was clean, minimal, the kind of space that communicated competence without ornamentation. Nathan sat behind his desk. Malcolm Reyes sat in the chair to the left, his jacket off, now his sleeves rolled up, looking like a man who had been running and had finally stopped and was trying to remember how to breathe normally. Jackson walked in, and Malcolm looked up. Something passed between them, not warmth, but recognition. 2 men who had been inside the same structure and were only now beginning to understand what it had actually been. "You talked to Olivia," Jackson said. "She's very persuasive," Malcolm said. "She is," Jackson agreed. He sat down. "Nathan said there's something I need to hear." Nathan looked at Malcolm. Malcolm leaned forward and put his hands on his knees and said, "There's a federal judge." Jackson went absolutely still. Malcolm told him everything. The same things he had told Olivia, and then more, because 3 hours of talking with Nathan had loosened things that had been held tight for 8 years. And once a person starts telling the truth, after a long silence, the truth tends to keep coming. He described the document he had found, the name, the dates, The 3 major cases that had moved through that judge's courtroom in the past decade, 2 of them involving Sterling Global competitors. One of them, Malcolm said, involving a company that had been trying to expose Sterling Global's international licensing practices through a whistleblower lawsuit. That case had been dismissed in 2019 by the same judge. The whistleblower, Jackson said slowly. What happened to him? Malcolm looked at the desk. Her name was Susan Park. She was a mid-level compliance officer at a firm that had a joint venture with one of our subsidiaries. He paused. After the dismissal, she lost her position, had difficulty finding work in the industry. I heard she moved out of the city. He stopped. I didn't ask more questions than that. The room was quiet. We need to find Susan Park, Jackson said to Nathan. Already on it, Nathan said. My contact at Justice flagged the 2019 case this afternoon when I sent the preliminary filing. They're looking at it. If she's willing to talk, she'll talk, Nathan said. People who try to do the right thing and get destroyed for it, they're usually still willing to talk. They've been waiting for someone to ask. Jackson stood up and walked to the window and stood there in the way he had been standing at windows all day at his father's house, at his own kitchen, at the boardroom, as though every significant moment of this day had driven him to glass and light and the need to look at something larger than the room he was in. My father built this over 50 years, he said. It came out like something between a statement and a question. Yes, Nathan said, and I walked into it 4 years ago and put my name on it and called it a career. He turned around. How many people got hurt? Not just regulators who took money. How many people, real people, got run over by whatever machinery my father was operating? Nathan and Malcolm exchanged a glance. That, Nathan said, is part of what Justice is going to spend the next several months determining. I want to know, Jackson said. Whatever they find, I want to know all of it. Jackson, Malcolm said, and his voice was careful. Some of it is going to be very difficult to hear. I know, Jackson said. I still want to know. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was Olivia. He picked up immediately. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Something tight. Jackson, has Nathan told you about the text message I received this afternoon? The warning text, he mentioned it. There's been a second one, she said, 20 minutes ago. This one had a photograph attached. Jackson's hand tightened on the phone. What photograph? A photograph of me, she said. Outside the coffee shop where I met Malcolm. Someone was watching. He was already moving, reaching for his jacket with his free hand. Are you at the house? Yes. Nathan's security is here. I'm fine, Jackson. I'm not calling because I'm scared. A pause. I'm calling because you need to know that whoever is doing this, they knew about the Malcolm meeting. They knew within minutes of it happening, which means either your father had someone following me all day or there's someone inside Nathan's operation, Jackson said. Silence. Nathan, Jackson said without lowering the phone. Nathan was already sitting forward. I heard, he said. It's not my team. His voice was certain, not defensive, certain. I've worked with the same 4 people for 8 years. But, he stopped. But what? Jackson said. Malcolm, Nathan said slowly, who did you tell that you were meeting Olivia today? Malcolm's face changed. No one, he said. Then slower. No one. I took an Uber. I didn't use my work phone. I didn't... He stopped. My assistant. She saw me leave. I told her I had a personal appointment, that's all. What's your assistant's name? Nathan said. Grace Choi. She's been with me for 6 years. She would never... Who hired her? Nathan said. Malcolm opened his mouth, closed it. Richard's office coordinated the hire, he said. Standard practice for senior executive support staff. HR runs the process, but the recommendation came from... He stopped. His voice went flat. From Richard's office. Nathan was already on his own phone. I need a full background check on Grace Choi, he said to whoever answered. Current employee of Sterling Global Executive Assistant to the CFO. I need it in 30 minutes. He hung up, looked at Jackson. Go home. Be with Olivia. I'll handle this end. Jackson was already at the door. Call me the minute you know anything. He drove home faster than he should have. He pushed through traffic with the focused, barely contained urgency of a man who has spent the entire day making large, consequential decisions and has now arrived at the only decision that actually matters, the one that has nothing to do with corporations or federal investigators or the collapse of his father's empire, and everything to do with the woman waiting at home who is 35 weeks pregnant and has spent the day being watched and warned and threatened while simultaneously dismantling a 23-year criminal structure almost entirely through patience and intelligence. He pulled into the driveway at 4:52. The security Nathan had arranged was visible, a man near the front entrance, another near the garage. They acknowledged Jackson with a nod. He went inside. Olivia was in the living room, sitting in the armchair, feet up, hands folded on her stomach. She had the look she always had when she was thinking very hard, and had decided not to show it on her face, which was to say she looked almost completely calm, except for the very slight tension in her jaw that he had learned over 4 years to read. "You drove fast," she said. "You were photographed," he said. "I was aware of that." He sat down on the couch across from her. He looked at her. Really looked the way you look at someone when you have spent a long time not looking carefully enough and are now trying to make up for it. She looked tired, not defeated, just tired in the specific way of someone who has been running at full capacity for a very long time and is starting to feel the distance they've covered. "Are you okay?" he said. "And I don't mean the situation, I mean you, physically." She looked slightly surprised by the question, as though she had been so focused on the mechanics of the day that being asked about herself was briefly disorienting. "I'm fine," she said. Then more honestly, "I'm tired. My back hurts. I had approximately 8 times more adrenaline than is recommended for someone in my condition, and I'm feeling the drop." She paused. "He moved again this afternoon during the meeting with Malcolm. I think he was listening." Jackson looked at her stomach. Something moved through him that was entirely different from everything else he had felt today. Quieter, more fundamental. "We haven't talked about names," he said. She looked at him. "No." "Have you thought about it?" A pause. The question was strange and ordinary and completely out of place in the middle of everything, and maybe that was exactly why he'd asked it. Because in the middle of the machinery of crisis and disclosure, and his father's 50-year architecture and federal investigators and threatening text messages, there was a child. A real, actual, arriving child who didn't know any of this, who was going to come into the world in 5 weeks and be handed it as his inheritance. "I've thought about it," she said softly. "I keep coming back to one." "What is it?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That was my grandfather's name, my mother's father." "I know," she said. "She told me once that he was the only member of this family she ever fully trusted." Jackson sat with that. "She was probably right," he said. His phone rang. Nathan, he picked up. "Grace Choi," Nathan said without preamble. "Her background check is clean, but there's something else." He paused. "Her emergency contact on her Sterling Global HR file is a man named Daniel Graves." Jackson went cold. "Graves," he said. "Same last name as Elliot Graves, yes. I'm running the connection now, but my working assumption is nephew or younger relative, which means Richard Sterling's fixer potentially had an asset inside Malcolm's office for we need to check her hire date, potentially years." "She would have been reporting everything," Jackson said. "Every conversation Malcolm had, every document he looked at." "Which means Richard knew that Malcolm was showing signs of instability," Nathan said. "Which means he knew Malcolm was a risk before today, which means—" "He was already planning to move against Malcolm," Jackson said, "before I walked into the boardroom, before any of this morning happened." He stopped. "Nathan, how long has Richard been building a contingency that throws both me and Malcolm under the investigation?" "I don't know yet," Nathan said, "but I think that's the right question." A pause. "My justice contact called an hour ago. They're moving faster than I expected. They want a meeting tomorrow morning, with you and with Malcolm." "What time?" 8 a.m. I'll send the address. Come prepared to talk for several hours." Jackson hung up, looked at Olivia. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Justice Department." She nodded slowly. "Then today was enough." "Today was enough," he agreed. He paused. "Nathan found something else. There was someone in Malcolm's office, someone connected to Elliot Graves feeding information back to my father. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long?" "Don't know yet." "So Richard has known everything," she said. "Every move we made today, every conversation, he's been watching all of it." "Yes," she absorbed that. "And he still didn't stop us." Jackson looked at her. "What?" "He knew," she said. "He had eyes inside Malcolm's office. He almost certainly had eyes on this house. He knew Nathan contacted Justice. He knew about the voluntary disclosure." She met Jackson's eyes, and he couldn't stop it. He tried the text messages that photographed the board meeting, and he couldn't stop it. She paused. "Do you understand what that means?" He thought about it. "It means the structure is too exposed," he said slowly. "Even if he stops us, which he can't. Nathan's contact already has enough to open a formal investigation. The board is moving toward independent counsel. Malcolm is talking. The 2019 case is being reopened." He stopped. "He has no play left." "He has one play," Olivia said. "Which one?" "He comes to you," she said. "Before 8 a.m. tomorrow. He comes to you and he offers you something. A deal, a restructuring, an arrangement that makes the federal exposure manageable in exchange for you walking away from the voluntary disclosure and letting him negotiate directly with Justice." She held his gaze. "He'll frame it as protecting the family, protecting the company, protecting your son's inheritance." Jackson was quiet. "He'll call tonight," she said, "or he'll come in person. But he'll come." "And if he does," Jackson said, "that's your decision to make," she said, "not mine. I'm asking what you think." She looked at him for a long moment. "I think, she said carefully, "that your son is going to be born into whatever world you build for him between now and the moment he arrives. And I think the only thing that matters more than what you do tomorrow morning is what he learns from it someday." She paused. "Your father taught you that winning matters more than truth. You believed him for a long time." Another pause. "What do you want to teach your son?" Jackson sat with that question in the way you sit with something that has both a hard answer and an easy one, and that requires you to choose between them in full awareness of what the choice costs. At 8:47 p.m., his phone rang. His father's number. He looked at the screen, felt Olivia watching him from across the room, felt the weight of everything the day had been the greenhouse at 4:30 in the morning. The envelope, the torn papers, his wife's wrist, the study in Greenwich, the boardroom, Malcolm's face in the coffee shop, the ultrasound photo on Nathan's desk that Nathan had left out and that Jackson had looked at for a long moment before walking out. He picked up. "Dad," he said. "Jackson." Richard Sterling's voice was exactly what it always was, measured, controlled, carrying the full architecture of a lifetime's authority in a single word. "We need to talk." "I know," Jackson said. "Tonight. Come to the house." "No," Jackson said. "You come here." A pause, long enough to mean something. "All right," his father said. "I'll be there in an hour." He hung up. Olivia was watching him. "He's coming here," Jackson said. "I heard." She started to stand up. "You don't have to leave," he said. "I know," she said. "But this conversation needs to happen between the two of you." She paused. "Some things do." She walked to the doorway, stopped. "Jackson." "Yeah. Whatever he says tonight, whatever he offers, whatever he makes you feel." She held his gaze across the room with the clear, steady eyes of a woman who has loved someone imperfectly and been failed by them and is still in this moment trying to tell him the truth. "Remember what you told the board today. Remember why you said it." She went upstairs. Jackson sat alone in the living room. He sat with the quiet and the weight of the day and the sound of his own breathing and the knowledge that in approximately 60 minutes his father was going to walk through that door and try one final time to reshape the story into something Richard Sterling could survive. He thought about the envelope on the greenhouse table. He thought about the sound Olivia's voice made in the dark when she said, "Either way, what I know doesn't change." He thought about a compliance officer named Susan Park who had tried to tell the truth in 2019 and lost everything for it. He thought about his son's name, his grandfather's name, the only member of this family his mother ever fully trusted. He got up and poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter and waited. At 9:49 p.m. headlights swept across the front windows. Richard Sterling had arrived. Richard Sterling did not knock. He walked through the front door of Jackson's house the way he had always walked into every room of his life, as though the space had been waiting for him specifically, as though his presence was the thing that gave it meaning. He was dressed as if he had come from a dinner, dark suit, silver tie, not a thread out of place. 70 years old and carrying himself like a man who had never once in his life been required to apologize for anything. Jackson was standing in the living room. He had not sat down. He had spent the 40 minutes since the phone call, standing moving between the kitchen and the window and back again, running through every version of this conversation he could anticipate, trying to find the one his father hadn't already prepared for. Richard looked around the room, took in the absence of anyone else. "Where is Olivia?" he said. "Upstairs," Jackson said. "This is between us." Richard nodded once, as though approving the arrangement. He sat down, without being invited, in the armchair nearest the door, and he crossed one leg over the other and folded his hands in his lap, and he looked at his son with an expression that was almost something like affection. "You had a long day," Richard said. "So did you," Jackson said. "Sit down, son." "I'll stand." A pause. Richard accepted it without visible reaction. "All right." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I want to tell you something before we discuss anything else. I want to tell you that what I built Sterling Global, everything connected to it, I built it for you. That was always the purpose, a foundation, something that would outlast me and provide for the next generation and the one after that. You built it on bribery," Jackson said, "on corrupted regulators and a federal judge and 50 years of making sure the rules applied to everyone except us." "I built it in the world as it actually exists," Richard said without heat. "Not the world as idealists describe it. Every major institution in this country has arrangements. Every significant accumulation of wealth has history that doesn't survive too close an examination. I did what was necessary." "You did what was profitable," Jackson said. "Don't dress it up." Richard looked at him. "You're angry." "I'm past angry," Jackson said. "I'm somewhere on the other side of angry, where everything is very quiet and very clear." He sat down then across from his father because he realized he didn't need to be standing. He wasn't performing strength. He had it. "What are you offering?" Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Richard's expression. The shift of a man who had been waiting for exactly that question and was now moving into prepared territory. "The voluntary disclosure," Richard said. "It hasn't been formally received yet. Nathan Reed submitted a preliminary filing, but a preliminary filing is not a sworn statement. It can be withdrawn." He paused. "If it's withdrawn tonight before it becomes part of an active federal file, we have room to negotiate directly with justice, privately. The scope of any investigation can be managed. The exposure can be contained." "Managed," Jackson said. "Contained." "Yes. And my name on the authorization forms can be contextualized," Richard said. "I have relationships in this space, Jackson. People who understand nuance. The story of a son who signed documents under instruction from a founding CEO who had no full knowledge of the underlying structure that is a defensible story. I can make that story hold." Jackson looked at his father. "And Malcolm," he said. "Malcolm made his own choices today," Richard said. "Malcolm chose a side. What does that mean for him? It means he faces the consequences of that choice," Richard said simply, as though they were discussing a business decision with no human content whatsoever. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "And Olivia," he said. "The divorce filing, the prenup challenge, the civil proceedings." "Olivia will be taken care of financially," Richard said, "generously. She'll have everything she and the child need. The prenup terms can be revisited. I'll authorize it personally." "You'll authorize it," Jackson repeated. "It's not your marriage, Dad." "No," Richard said, "but I am in a position to facilitate a resolution that works for everyone." "Define everyone." Richard met his eyes. "The family, the company, the people whose livelihoods depend on Sterling Global continuing to function." He paused. "Your son. who is going to grow up either as the heir to something substantial or as the child of a man who burned it all down because he couldn't find a way to be practical. There it was. Jackson heard it land and recognized it for exactly what it was. Not a threat, not quite. A framing, a way of making the choice look different than it was. The same technique his father had been using for 40 years redefined the terms of the problem until the right answer looks like the wrong one, and the wrong answer looks like wisdom. "I want to ask you something," Jackson said, "and I want you to answer me honestly, just once, just this one time." Richard waited. "Was I ever anything other than the shield?" Jackson said. "Was there a version of your plan where I actually ran this company, where I was actually the CEO, and not just the name on the documents while you operated the real structure from behind me?" The silence that followed was the most honest thing his father had said all evening. Because Richard Sterling was a man who could construct a lie in real time with remarkable facility, but the silence, the specific quality of that silence, was not constructed. It was real. And it answered the question more completely than any words would have. "I see," Jackson said. Jackson said, "No." He said it the same way he had said it in the boardroom. Quiet. Final. "I see. I understand now." He stood up. "You built a liability shield. You put a son in the CEO's chair so that if the structure ever came apart, there was a name on the authorizations that wasn't yours. A public face. Someone the story could attach to." He looked at his father. "Did my mother know?" Richard's expression shifted. "Don't," he said. "Did she—" "Your mother is gone, Jackson. Did she know what this company was?" Jackson's voice was controlled, but the weight behind it was enormous, because she told Olivia that my grandfather, her father, was the only member of this family she ever fully trusted, and I've been thinking about that all day, what she meant by it, whether she knew. Richard Sterling stood up too, and for a moment, just a moment, the careful composure slipped, not into guilt, into something more complicated than guilt. The expression of a man who has lived a long time and made decisions that could not be unmade and has developed an extremely sophisticated system for not looking directly at them. "Your mother loved this family," he said. "She did what she did to protect it." "What did she do?" Jackson said. "She asked questions she later decided not to pursue," Richard said quietly, "and she made peace with that, as people do, as you could do." "I'm not her," Jackson said, "and this isn't 1995. He walked to the door of the living room and opened it. "I'll be at Nathan Reed's office at 7 a.m. tomorrow," he said. "I'll be at the Justice Department at 8. Malcolm will be there. Gerald Park has already indicated the board will cooperate with independent counsel." He looked at his father. "There is nothing left for you to manage, Dad. It's done." Richard Sterling stood in the middle of the living room and looked at his son, and for the first time in Jackson's memory, his father looked old. Not in the physical sense Richard Sterling would be formidable until his last day. That was simply the architecture of the man. But something behind the eyes, something that had been running a very long time and had just in this moment accepted that it was not going to outrun what was coming. "You're going to lose everything," Richard said. "The company, the money, the name." "I know," Jackson said. "And you're willing to do that." "I'm willing to let our son grow up knowing his father told the truth when it was hard," Jackson said. "Yes, I'm willing to do that." Richard Sterling walked to the door. He stopped in the hallway, his back to his son. "I did love you," he said. "Whatever else you believe about me, that was real." Jackson looked at his father's back. "I know," he said. "That's the part that makes all of it worse." Richard walked out. The door closed. Jackson stood in the living room and listened to his father's car pull out of the driveway and move away down the quiet street, and then he stood in the silence that followed and felt the full weight of 42 years settle and then slowly begin to lift. He heard footsteps on the stairs. Olivia came into the room. She had changed into the cream robe from the night before, and her hair was down, and she looked at him with eyes that asked the question without asking it. "He's gone," Jackson said. "What did he offer?" "Everything," Jackson said. "Withdrawal of the disclosure, protection of my name, the prenup terms reconsidered, your financial security, our son's inheritance." He paused. Essentially, he offered me the chance to become him. And I told him it was done. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Then she crossed the room and sat down on the couch, and she put her feet up and she said, "How are you?" He almost laughed, because the question was so ordinary, so specifically and deliberately human in the middle of everything extraordinary that had happened, that it cut right through all of it. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. He sat down beside her. Not close, but beside her in the same space, which was more than they had managed in a very long time. "I think I will be all right, eventually." He paused. "The divorce still proceeds." "Yes," she said. "The terms need to be fair," he said. "I want that on record between us, independent of what Nathan negotiates. I want it to be fair, not because of the legal exposure, because it should be." She looked at him. "It will be," she said. "And the name," he said, "for the baby. I want you to know I think it's right. Whatever happens between us, whatever the next year looks like, that name is right." She looked down at her hands, at the curve of her stomach, and something in her face very quietly let go of something it had been holding. "Thank you," she said softly. It was 10:43 p.m. The Justice Department meeting was 9 hours and 17 minutes away. The next several months would be what they would be. Federal proceedings, civil litigation, press attention of a kind that would be uncomfortable and prolonged and impossible to fully control. The Sterling Global Board would appoint interim leadership and independent counsel and begin the slow, painful process of institutional reckoning. Stock prices would fall further before they stabilized. Names would be in newspapers. Depositions would be given. Malcolm Reyes would spend the next 2 years in a cooperation agreement that cost him significantly and gave him in return the specific relief of a man who has finally put down a weight he carried too long. Susan Park, the compliance officer who had tried in 2019 to tell the truth and been run over by a rigged system, would receive a call from Nathan Reed, and she would sit down with federal investigators and tell them everything she had tried to tell them 6 years earlier. And this time someone would write it down and act on it. Richard Sterling would face charges. It would take 14 months for the indictment to come, and when it did, it would be for wire fraud, bribery of a public official, and obstruction of justice, not all 23 years of it, because the law is imperfect, and memory fades, and evidence degrades, but enough. Enough to be real. Enough to constitute a consequence. Elliot Graves would disappear quietly and then reappear 18 months later as a cooperating witness who had made his own calculation about which side of this he wanted to be on. Gerald Park would chair an independent review board and spend 2 years rebuilding Sterling Global's governance structure from the inside, the way you rebuild a house that has a rotten foundation, carefully, slowly knowing that the work is unglamorous and that the people watching are mostly watching to see if it collapses. And Jackson would stand in a federal building at 8 a.m. the following morning and give a statement. He would answer questions for 4 hours. He would hand over every document, every communication, every memory he had of 11 years spent inside the architecture his father built. It would be the hardest 4 hours of his life, and also, he would think afterward, the most honest, the most fundamentally himself he had ever been in a professional context. He would lose the CEO title formally within 30 days. He would lose a significant portion of his personal assets in the civil proceedings. He would lose his father not to death, but to the long, cold distance that forms between two people when one of them has refused to lie for the other. He would not lose his son. William Thomas Sterling was born on a Tuesday morning in January, 6 weeks after the envelope, 4 weeks after the Justice Department meeting, 3 weeks after the first press reports appeared, 2 weeks after the board accepted Jackson's formal resignation, and 1 week after Richard Sterling's attorneys filed their initial response to the federal investigation. He was born at 6:17 in the morning, and he was healthy, and he had Olivia's eyes. Jackson was in the room. He had asked, and Olivia had said yes, and he had stood at the edge of something enormous and watched his son arrive in the world and felt the specific, irreducible weight of a new human being placed in his arms for the first time. He stood there for a long time. Olivia watched him from the bed, exhausted and clear-eyed and present in the full, unguarded way of a woman who has been through something enormous and come out the other side still standing. "Hey," she said softly. He looked up. "You okay?" she said. He looked down at his son, at the small, perfect, entirely new face, at the eyes that were already taking in light and finding it interesting. "Yeah," he said. His voice was rough. "Yeah, I am." "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like you," Jackson said. "He looks like himself," she said, "which is the best thing he could possibly look like." Jackson carried his son to the chair beside Olivia's bed and sat down, and William Thomas Sterling, who had been listening from the inside for 9 months and had arrived into a world that was already being rebuilt for him, made a small sound and settled, and Jackson held on. 3 months later, on a morning in April, Jackson sat in a coffee shop in the city. Not the Sterling Global neighborhood, not the midtown streets where all of this had played out, but a quieter block, a place that didn't know his name, and he opened a notebook. He had started keeping one, which was something he had never done before. He wrote things in it, not strategy, not business plans, just things he was thinking about, things he was learning. That morning he wrote the envelope on the greenhouse table. "She had built it all while I was looking somewhere else. She saw what I was before I did, and she still told me the truth instead of just leaving. I don't know what that says about her. I know it says something about the kind of person I have to become." He closed the notebook. His phone showed a message from Nathan. "Federal proceedings update. Richard's attorneys have requested a conference. Progress. Call when you can." And below it, a message from Olivia. A photograph. William asleep in the afternoon light, his face slack and peaceful, and completely unaware of the world that had rearranged itself to make room for him. Jackson looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he put the phone in his pocket and sat with his coffee and the April morning and the specific, unadorned feeling of being exactly where he was, which was not where he had planned to be, and was not comfortable, and was not simple, and was... He was beginning to understand the first real ground he had ever stood on. He thought about what Olivia had said in the kitchen on the morning after the greenhouse, the morning that had started everything. She had said, "Do it because it's right, not because you're angry, not because you're scared, because our son is going to ask questions someday." Someday was already coming. It arrived every morning now in a small face and open eyes and the specific clarifying weight of someone who depended on him to be a better version of himself than he had managed so far. He was working on it. That was the truth, and the truth he had learned at considerable cost was the only foundation that held. Jackson Sterling picked up his coffee and walked out into the April morning and began again.